Stand beneath Park Street Station today, and you're walking 20 feet from a sealed platform frozen in 1916. Complete with vintage ads still on the walls, wooden benches gathering dust, and gas lamps that haven't flickered in over a century. Boston's first subway, opened in 1897, isn't just what you ride, it's an iceberg. Behind brick walls and beneath your feet lies a ghost network, duplicate stations built but never opened, tunnels that descend into darkness and simply stop, entire platforms where trains haven't stopped for 90 years. When crews broke through a wall in 2019, they found a complete test platform that existed on no map, forgotten for 106 years. These aren't romantic ruins. They're engineering mistakes, political compromises, and abandoned dreams, sealed off when Boston realized it had built for the wrong future. The subway you see solved a crisis. The one you can't see shows what that solution actually cost. Howard A. Carson didn't look like a revolutionary. The chief engineer of the Boston Transit Commission was a methodical man, 43 years old in 1895, known for his conservative estimates and careful calculations. He had spent 15 years building railroads across Massachusetts, and he approached the subway project with the cautious pragmatism of someone who had seen plenty of ambitious schemes fail. But Carson had made a promise to the Massachusetts legislature that many considered impossible. He would build America's first subway in just 2 years, and he would do it without disrupting street traffic above. No European city had managed such a feat. The London Underground, begun in 1863, had taken decades to complete and had torn apart entire neighborhoods in the process. Paris was still arguing about whether to build a subway at all. Yet, here was Carson, promising to tunnel beneath Boston's crooked colonial streets, some barely 20 feet wide, while businesses remained open and trolleys continued running overhead. The newspapers called it madness. Carson called it mathematics. His plan was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its ambition. The subway would run for approximately 1.8 miles, from the Public Garden to North Station, following the path of Tremont Street and then branching toward the two major railroad terminals. But instead of the deep-bore tunneling used in London, Carson proposed something far more audacious: cut-and-cover construction right down the middle of the street. His crews would excavate a trench 25 feet deep, build the tunnel structure inside it, then cover it back up and restore the street surface. All of this would happen in sections, allowing traffic to flow around the construction. The mathematics suggested it could work. The reality would prove far more complicated. Because Carson's plan contained a fundamental miscalculation, one that wouldn't become apparent until years later, long after the champagne corks from the opening ceremony had been swept away. He had designed the tunnel for the streetcar system of 1895, not anticipating how rapidly that system would evolve, how the demands would multiply, how the simple tube he was building would almost immediately prove inadequate for the city's needs. The excavation began on March 28, 1895, at the corner of Boylston and Tremont Streets, and within 48 hours, Carson's crews encountered their first crisis. As they dug down through the layers of packed earth and construction debris, Boston had been continuously built over itself since 1630, they hit water. Not groundwater seeping through soil, but actual flowing water, the buried remains of Smelt Brook, a stream that had been covered over and forgotten decades earlier, but which still flowed beneath the city streets. The brook had become a subterranean river, and it was now flooding the excavation at a rate of over 3,000 gallons per hour. Carson's pumps ran continuously for 6 weeks before the flow was finally diverted. But Smelt Brook was merely the first surprise. Beneath Tremont Street, the crews found artifacts of every era of Boston's history: colonial-era foundations, Revolutionary War fortifications, intact cobblestone streets from the 1780s, a complete horse stable from 1823, and, most disturbingly, an unmarked burial ground containing dozens of coffins, the wood still preserved in the wet clay, the bones inside clearly visible, through gaps in the decayed lids. The deeper they dug, the more unstable the ground became. Boston, unlike New York with its bedrock or Chicago with its clay, was built on filled land. Centuries of garbage, construction debris, and soil dumped into tidal marshes and shallow bays. In some places, the excavation revealed pockets of what the workers called blue mud, a consistency somewhere between liquid and solid that would ooze rather than flow, capable of slowly engulfing anything placed in it. One worker, a man named Patrick O'Brien, described in a letter to his sister how his shovel had simply disappeared into this mud, sucked down as if by some living thing never to be recovered. The crews began encountering pockets of methane gas, igniting when struck by metal tools, causing small explosions that injured several men. By July 1895, the project had already exceeded its injury projections for the entire 2 years. Carson ordered the installation of electric lighting throughout the excavation, one of the first construction sites in America to be lit electrically, because the gas lamps they had been using kept triggering methane explosions. The bills for electric power alone were consuming nearly 10% of the project's budget. But the greatest challenge wasn't the ground beneath, it was the city above. Carson had promised minimal disruption, but the reality of having a 25-foot trench running down the center of Tremont Street proved catastrophic for businesses. The vibrations from pile-driving damaged building foundations. The dust created respiratory problems. The noise was relentless, 24 hours a day. Carson had crews working in 3 8-hour shifts to meet his deadline. Merchants reported sales dropping by 40 to 60%. Several businesses simply closed. The Boston Chamber of Commerce began lobbying the legislature to halt the project. Carson responded by accelerating the work schedule, which only increased the accidents and injuries. In September 1895, a section of false work, temporary wooden supports, collapsed at Park Street, killing 3 workers and injuring 11 more. The Boston Herald ran a front-page illustration showing the Grim Reaper standing over the excavation with the caption, "Boston's Grave." Carson didn't attend the funerals. He was too busy redesigning the support systems to prevent another collapse. As the tunnel took shape, it revealed itself to be unlike any subway built before or since. European subways had been designed as pure transportation infrastructure, functional tubes to move people from point to point. But Carson's tunnel was something different, a public work built during the City Beautiful movement, reflecting the American belief that infrastructure should be architecture, that even underground spaces should elevate the human spirit. The stations weren't simply platforms, they were underground halls clad in white glazed tile, with vaulted brick ceilings rising 16 feet overhead. Each station featured different decorative motifs. Park Street had classical Roman arches, Boylston Street had Byzantine capitals, Scala Square incorporated Celtic knots in the ironwork. The platforms were illuminated by hundreds of Edison electric bulbs, making the subway brighter than many surface streets at night. Contemporary photographs show women in formal dress waiting for trains, treating the subway as a destination in itself, a marvel to be experienced rather than merely used. But beneath this architectural optimism lay a series of compromises that would haunt the system for decades. The tunnel's diameter was determined not by future needs but by present constraints, specifically by the size of the streetcars that would use it. The tracks were laid at standard gauge, 4 feet 8.5 inches, because that's what the existing streetcar system used. The platforms were designed for cars 60 feet long, because that's what ran on the surface. The ventilation shafts were sized for the smoke, from maybe 24 cars at a time, because that's all that was expected. Every dimension, every specification was calibrated for the transit system of 1897. Carson was building for the Boston he knew, not the Boston that was coming. And Boston was growing faster than anyone anticipated. The tunnel's route itself was a compromise between engineering logic and political reality. The original plan called for a straight path from the public garden to North Station, but this would have required demolishing buildings and compensating property owners. Instead, the tunnel followed the existing street pattern, incorporating curves and grades that would limit operational speeds. At Scollay Square, the tunnel executed a sharp curve, nearly 90 degrees, because the legislature refused to approve the demolition of the Revere House Hotel. At Haymarket, the tunnel descended at a 5% grade, twice the recommended maximum, because there wasn't enough horizontal distance to achieve a gentler slope. These compromises were documented in the Transit Commission's reports, noted as temporary expedients that could be corrected later. But later never came. The compromises became permanent, and the tunnel's limitations were literally set in stone. The subway opened to the public at 6 o'clock in the morning on September 1st, 1897, and within an hour it was clear that Boston had built something extraordinary. The first car, decorated with American flags and carrying Mayor Josiah Quincy and the transit commissioners, departed Park Street Station to the sound of a brass band playing on the platform. But it was the second car, carrying ordinary passengers, that revealed the subway's true impact. Men who had spent an hour each morning fighting through Tremont Street traffic now made the journey in 7 minutes. Women who had avoided downtown shopping because of the chaos now rode the subway several times a week. The Boston Globe reported that on the first full day of operation, over 100,000 people rode the subway, in a city of only 560,000 residents. The demand exceeded Carson's most optimistic projections by nearly 40%. The success was immediate and overwhelming. Within a week, the West End Street Railway was running trains every 3 minutes during peak hours, and still people crowded the platforms. The waiting areas at Park Street, designed for perhaps 60 people, regularly held 200 packed shoulder to shoulder. The ventilation system, adequate for the projected traffic, proved insufficient for the actual traffic. Passengers complained of oppressive heat and stale air. The narrow staircases created bottlenecks, with people waiting 5 or 10 minutes just to exit the station. But nobody complained too loudly, because despite these flaws, the subway worked. It had solved the problem it was built to solve. Tremont Street, for the first time in a decade, flowed freely. The surface trolleys that remained could actually move. Downtown businesses reported immediate increases in foot traffic and sales. The Boston Evening Transcript declared the subway the greatest civic achievement in American history. Yet even in these early days of triumph, there were warning signs that went largely unnoticed. The sharp curve at Scollay Square caused frequent wheel squealing and occasional derailments. Minor incidents that were quickly corrected, but which indicated the limitations of the tunnel's geometry. The steep grade at Haymarket required trains to slow significantly, creating delays that compounded during rush hours. Most significantly, the single-tube design meant that all trains, both directions, shared the same tunnel in certain sections, with interlocking switches controlling the flow. This worked adequately when trains ran every 5 minutes, but as demand increased and service became more frequent, the system began approaching its theoretical capacity. Carson himself noted in his final report to the Transit Commission that the tunnel should be considered a prototype rather than a complete system, requiring expansion and modification as the city grew. But Boston was too busy celebrating to think about expansion. The subway was finished, the problem was solved, and the future would take care of itself. The future arrived faster than anyone anticipated. By 1901, just 4 years after opening, the Tremont Street subway was operating at maximum capacity, and the city was already planning expansions. The first addition was a northern extension to Sullivan Square, completed in 1908, which added new tunnel segments but also created new complexities in the routing. Then came the Cambridge Tunnel in 1912, connecting the subway to Harvard Square. Each expansion added more branches, more switching points, more opportunities for delays and congestion. The simple loop that Carson had designed was becoming a tangled web, and the original tunnel was increasingly inadequate for the traffic it needed to handle. But the most transformative change came from an unexpected direction: the decision to convert from streetcars to dedicated subway cars. The original Tremont Street subway had been designed as an underground extension of the surface trolley network, with the same cars running both below and above ground. But engineers realized that dedicated subway cars could be longer, faster, and more efficient. In 1914, the Boston Elevated Railway began replacing the old streetcars with purpose-built subway vehicles 72 feet long, 20% longer than the original rolling stock. The platforms had to be extended, the electrical systems had to be upgraded, and critically, the tunnel clearances, which had been calculated for smaller cars, now became problematic in several locations. This is when the first sections of the original tunnel were abandoned. At Scollay Square, the sharp curve that had been manageable for 60-foot streetcars became dangerous for 72-foot subway cars. The longer wheelbase meant that cars leaned significantly on the curve, coming within inches of the tunnel walls. In 1916, after a car actually scraped the wall and shattered several windows, the decision was made to bypass the curve entirely. A new tunnel segment was blasted through the bedrock, expensive, difficult work that Carson's cut-and-cover method couldn't accomplish, creating a gentler curve. The old curve was sealed off with brick walls and abandoned, still containing the original tracks and signals, a complete ghost station frozen in 1916 and waiting in darkness. Park Street Station, the crown jewel of Carson's original design, suffered a similar fate through a more gradual process. The station, as built in 1897, had two platforms serving two tracks, configured in what engineers call a Spanish solution, each platform serving trains in both directions. This worked adequately when service was infrequent, but as trains became more numerous, the configuration created dangerous situations with passengers crowding near platform edges as trains passed in both directions. In 1912, the Transit Commission approved a complete reconstruction of Park Street, adding 2 additional tracks and reconfiguring the platforms for one-way service. The reconstruction happened in stages over 18 months, during which time the station remained partially operational. The old northbound platform, a grand space with vaulted ceilings and ornate tile work, was closed first. Passengers were routed to temporary wooden platforms, while construction proceeded. When the new configuration opened in 1914, the old platform was no longer needed. Rather than demolish it, a complex and expensive proposition given that it sat beneath an active street, the Transit Commission simply sealed it off. Brick walls were built at both ends of the platform. The entrances were filled in and the space was left as it had been, complete with vintage advertising posters still on the walls, wooden benches still in place, the old gas lamp fixtures still mounted though no longer connected. Today, modern Green Line passengers at Park Street walk within 20 feet of this sealed space, never knowing it exists. But the most extensive abandonment at Park Street involved the lower level, a section that appears on no modern transit map and is rarely mentioned in official histories. Carson's original design had included provisions for future expansion, specifically a lower level that could accommodate additional tracks if demand warranted. The space was partially excavated in 1897, intended to be completed later, but as the system evolved in unexpected directions, this lower level was never finished. Instead, it became a storage area, then a workshop, then gradually just forgotten space, accessed only by maintenance workers who needed to reach certain utility connections. Over the decades, this unfinished level became a repository for abandoned equipment, old signals, obsolete turnouts, wooden ties from track replacements, even several complete streetcars that had been used during the original opening ceremony and then, inexplicably, rolled down to this lower level and left there. One of these cars, number 1752, still sits in the darkness beneath Park Street. Its paint faded, its seats rotted, its destination sign still reading North Station via Tremont. Boylston Street Station presents perhaps the most intriguing abandonment in the entire system, because what was sealed off wasn't old infrastructure, but rather a complete duplicate of the operating station. In 1914, as part of the same reconstruction program that modified Park Street, the Transit Commission approved building a second Boylston station immediately adjacent to the first. The two stations would be identical in design but serve different directions, eliminating the dangerous Spanish solution configuration. Construction proceeded rapidly, and by late 1915, the new Boylston station was complete. Platforms, tiled in the same white glazed brick as the original, identical vaulted ceilings, matching Art Nouveau light fixtures, even duplicate decorative mosaics showing Boston landmarks. But before the new station could open, the entire project was canceled. World War I had begun, and the Boston Elevated Railway, anticipating financial difficulties and potential metal shortages, decided to postpone all non-essential improvements. The opening of the second Boylston station was deemed non-essential. Passengers were already accustomed to the Spanish solution configuration, and with wartime travel restrictions reducing ridership, the capacity wasn't immediately needed. The new station would open after the war, officials promised. But the war ended, the financial situation worsened rather than improved, and the second Boylston station simply sat there, unused, waiting for an opening day that would never come. In 1923, facing budget pressures and needing to reduce maintenance costs, the Transit Commission officially abandoned the duplicate station. The entrances were bricked up, the ventilation shafts were capped, and the space was left complete but empty. For decades, Boston operated two Boylston stations side by side, one crowded with passengers, the other pristine and silent. The sealed station became something of an urban legend among transit workers, a place mentioned in whispered stories about ghost platforms and phantom trains. In the 1950s, during construction work, a demolition crew accidentally broke through into the sealed station and found it nearly unchanged from 1915. The paint still fresh, the fixtures still shining, even paper schedules still in the display cases, advertising service to destinations that no longer existed on routes that had been reconfigured decades earlier. The 1908 northern extension to Sullivan Square created its own geography of abandonment, though of a different character than the downtown sections. The extension had been built to serve the growing working-class neighborhoods of Charlestown and Somerville, areas experiencing rapid industrial growth and housing development. But the tunnel's route, determined by political compromises and property acquisition challenges, followed a path that quickly proved suboptimal. Instead of running directly north, the tunnel curved east, then north, then west, adding nearly a mile to the journey and creating three stations, Thompson Square, Sullivan Square Lower, and Everett Avenue, that served relatively sparse populations. These stations were built during Boston's first subway construction boom, a period when confidence in endless growth led to overbuilding. Each station was massive, designed to handle crowds that never materialized. Thompson Square had platforms 400 feet long, capable of accommodating 6-car trains, serving a neighborhood that rarely produced enough passengers to fill a single car. Sullivan Square Lower, positioned beneath the elevated Sullivan Square station, was intended as a grand transfer point where passengers could switch between subway and elevated trains. But the transfer proved unpopular. Most passengers preferred to stay on their original service rather than change, and Sullivan Square Lower never carried more than a fraction of its designed capacity. By the 1920s, these stations were consuming far more in operating costs than they generated in fares. The platforms required constant lighting, ventilation, and maintenance for a handful of daily passengers. In 1925, the Boston Elevated Railway petitioned to close Thompson Square and Everett Avenue stations, citing annual losses of over $15,000 per station, roughly $250,000 in current dollars. The petition was approved, and on June 30th, 1926, both stations closed. But unlike the downtown abandonments, which were carefully sealed and preserved, these northern stations were simply shuttered. The entrances were locked, the lights turned off, and the spaces left to decay. No brick walls were built, no formal decommissioning occurred. The trains simply stopping there, running express past dark platforms where a few forgotten passengers occasionally waited, unaware the stations were closed, wondering why train after train passed without slowing. What makes Boston's abandoned subway sections particularly fascinating is how they preserve not just one era, but multiple eras stacked atop each other, like archaeological strata. The lowest layer is Carson's original 1897 infrastructure, with its handmade brick arches, its wrought iron supports, its gas lamp mountings. Above this, the 1914 to 1918 reconstruction layer, with its concrete reinforcements, its electrical conduits, its steel I-beams. Then the 1920s modifications, the 1930s repairs, each era leaving its mark, adding its layer, creating a cross-section of Boston transit history visible in the walls of these sealed spaces. Maintenance workers who have entered these abandoned sections describe them as time capsules, but not simple ones. They're time capsules where different eras coexist in the same space, where a 1897 brick wall stands next to a 1930s concrete support, where Victorian-era gas pipes run parallel to mid-century electrical cables. In one abandoned section near Scullay Square, now completely inaccessible, sealed behind construction that built the modern government center station, there's supposedly a maintenance room where you can see 5 different generations of electrical systems, from the original 1897 DC installation to a 1980s AC upgrade, all still in place, none removed, each system simply bypassed by the next. These layers tell the story of how infrastructure actually evolves, which is rarely the clean narrative presented in official histories. Systems don't get replaced, they get supplemented, worked around, built over. The Boston subway isn't a series of discrete projects, but rather a continuous accretion, with each generation adding to what came before rather than replacing it. The abandoned sections are where this reality is most visible, because these are the places where the accretion stopped, where time froze at whatever point the section was sealed. A platform closed in 1916 shows only layers up to 1916. A tunnel abandoned in 1926 stops at 1926. They're like tree rings, except instead of recording climate, they record the evolution of urban infrastructure. But perhaps the most intriguing abandoned spaces aren't the ones that were built and later sealed. They're the ones that were partially built and never completed. Boston's subway system is riddled with these half-finished extensions, tunnels that go nowhere, platforms that were roughed in but never tiled, staircases that descend to sealed doors. The most extensive of these is the so-called Riverbank Extension, begun in 1926 and abandoned in 1929 when the funding ran out. The Riverbank Extension was meant to connect the Tremont Street subway to a new tunnel along the Charles River, serving the West End and eventually extending to Cambridge via a new bridge. Construction began enthusiastically, with over 2,000 feet of tunnel excavated and the rough structure of 3 stations built. But the project was plagued by water infiltration. The tunnel ran through waterlogged fill close to the river, and costs quickly spiraled beyond the allocated budget. In 1928, facing a budget crisis and growing public skepticism about subway expansion, the Transit Commission suspended work on the extension. The suspension was meant to be temporary, just until finances improved. But 1929 brought the stock market crash, and any hope of completing the riverbank extension evaporated. What remains is a tunnel that descends from a junction near Boylston Station, runs for roughly 2,000 feet toward the river, then simply stops at a wall of earth and rock. The 3 station structures, bare concrete boxes without any finishing, sit in darkness, never having served a single passenger. Transit workers call this the tunnel to nowhere, though technically it's more accurate to call it a tunnel to a wall of earth about 2,000 feet from its starting point. Every few decades, there's a proposal to complete the extension, some grand plan to finally realize the 1926 vision. But the proposals always founder on the same basic problem. The tunnel goes in the wrong direction for modern needs, and completing it would mean building infrastructure to serve a city that no longer exists. The abandoned sections of Boston's subway system exist in a peculiar state of preservation. They're not maintained, no one cleans them, repairs them, or monitors their condition, but they're also not accessible to the forces that usually cause decay. Sealed off from weather, protected from vandalism, isolated from the surface world, these spaces decay very slowly, in a kind of geological time rather than historical time. Paint that would flake and fade in a decade if exposed to air and moisture can last a century in the stable, dry environment of a sealed tunnel. Wood that would rot in years remains intact for decades. Paper schedules from 1915, printed on acidic newsprint that should have disintegrated by now, remain legible because they've been sealed in an environment with minimal oxygen and no light. But this preservation is accidental and incomplete. Water infiltration, though minimal, does occur, causing rust, staining, and gradual deterioration. Rats and insects find their way into some sections, nesting in the abandoned spaces, chewing through materials. Most significantly, vibrations from operating trains in adjacent tunnels cause structural stress, slowly weakening the old brickwork and concrete. The abandoned sections are preserved, but they're not frozen. They're decaying in slow motion, deteriorating at a rate measured in decades rather than years, but deteriorating nonetheless. The Transit Authority's official policy is benign neglect. The sealed sections are monitored for structural integrity. Engineers periodically inspect the walls and ceilings to ensure they're not collapsing into active tunnels, but no effort is made to preserve their historical character. When a sealed section develops a problem, the solution is usually to seal it further, adding modern concrete walls in front of old brick, reinforcing old supports with new steel, gradually encasing the original infrastructure in layers of pragmatic modern repairs. The result is that some abandoned sections are now sealed behind multiple generations of walls, each layer representing a different era's response to decay. 1950s concrete behind 1970s, concrete behind 1990s concrete, with Carson's original 1897 brickwork somewhere at the center, visible to no one. This raises a philosophical question that Boston has never really confronted. Are these abandoned spaces part of the city's heritage that should be preserved, or are they simply obsolete infrastructure that happens to still exist? The Transit Authority treats them as the latter, utilitarian spaces with no value beyond their structural role in supporting active tunnels. But historians, archaeologists, and transit enthusiasts increasingly view them as the former. irreplaceable examples of early American subway engineering that deserve protection and possibly public access. The few times sections have been opened for tours, most notably in 1987 during the subway's 90th anniversary, the response has been overwhelming, with thousands of people applying for the limited slots. But these tours also revealed the challenges of access. The abandoned sections aren't designed for visitors. They have no lighting, no safe walkways, no emergency exits. Making them publicly accessible would require extensive modifications that would paradoxically destroy the very authenticity that makes them interesting. And so they remain sealed, preserved but invisible, protected by their inaccessibility, decaying slowly in darkness. Today, the exact extent of Boston's abandoned subway infrastructure is uncertain. The Transit Authority maintains records of officially sealed sections, but these records are incomplete, often lacking precise locations or current conditions. Some sections shown as sealed on 1950s maps are now completely inaccessible, buried behind newer construction. Others marked as active turn out to contain abandoned platforms or closed passages. Transit workers occasionally discover sealed spaces that don't appear in any official records, suggesting that the network of abandonments is larger and more complex than documented. The most recent discovery came in 2019 during construction work for the Green Line extension. Workers breaking through what they thought was a solid foundation wall instead found an intact platform, roughly 60 feet long, tiled in white brick with ornate decorative borders. The platform didn't appear on any map, modern or historical. It took archivists several weeks to determine that this was likely a test platform built around 1913, used to evaluate different tile patterns and materials before applying them throughout the system. Once the testing was complete, the platform was sealed and apparently forgotten. Its existence lost when the engineer who ordered its construction retired and his personal notes were discarded. How many more such spaces exist? The best estimate suggests somewhere between 15 and 25 significant abandoned sections. Platforms, station areas, or substantial tunnel segments no longer in use. But this number is speculative, based on incomplete records and the knowledge that every few years, construction crews discover something that wasn't supposed to be there. Boston's subway is an iceberg. The active system you can ride is merely the visible portion, while beneath and behind it lies a larger volume of abandoned, sealed, and forgotten infrastructure. The ghost system that made the visible system possible. Some of these spaces will eventually be rediscovered, opened during construction projects or infrastructure upgrades. Others may remain sealed indefinitely, slowly deteriorating until they're no longer recognizable as platforms or tunnels, becoming simply voids in the earth beneath Boston, their purpose and history forgotten. And perhaps a few will stay intact, preserved by accident and isolation, waiting in darkness for some future archaeologist to break through the walls and discover what we built, what we abandoned, what we forgot. They're time capsules we didn't mean to create, preserving not our greatest achievements, but our miscalculations, our compromises, our expedient decisions to build around problems rather than solve them. In this sense, the abandoned sections of Boston's subway might be more historically valuable than the parts still in use, because they show us not what we meant to build, but what we actually built, and what we left behind when it no longer served our purposes.